Hey everyone, this is a review by Paul Blanc of the second volume of Sean Matgamna's The Fate of the Russian Revolution. So here we go. With the publication of two fat volumes of documents under the heading The Fate of the Russian Revolution, under the editorship of Sean Matgamna, the workers' liberty current in Britain has performed a genuine service for scholars and activists. New section. Something of value. In a sense, we are presented with three books in the guise of two, with the editor producing introductions of 156 pages in the first volume and 125 pages, including timeline and glossary, in the second. This, quote, book, end quote, of 281 pages advances a line of argument that champions the perspectives of Max Shachtman, a U.S. associate of Leon Trotsky, who broke with him in 1940. Just out is the 790-page second installment, The Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism, published by Workers' Liberty in 2015, dealing with the contending views within the U.S. Trotskyist movement in the 1940s, specifically those aligned with Trotsky and James P. Cannon in the Socialist Workers' Party and those aligned with Shachtman and what became, for a while, the Workers' Party. The previous volume is actually titled The Fate of the Russian Revolution, published in London by Phoenix Press in 1998, basically presenting the views of Shachtman and the current he led during the 1940s and early 1950s. A, quote, slimmer volume, it weighs in at slightly over 60 pages. It was actually published as Volume 1 of, quote, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, end quote, an overarching banner that seems to have been dropped. There are some who, for whatever reasons, do not think there is much or any importance to such history and have expressed the view that the publication of these volumes is ridiculous. It is certainly true that pouring through old left-wing documents from the 1930s and 1940s is not something that most people are inclined or in a position to do, but to deny that there is anything useful to learn from such excavations and explorations is inconsistent with a serious attitude towards the discipline of history as well as toward political theory, not to mention Marxism. What's more, the materials by Shachtman and his comrades are packed with interesting ideas, useful information, and sometimes delicious humor. For some of us, at least, they are well worth looking at. There are others who complain that the two volumes are skewed to favor the Shachtmanite orientation, and they certainly are, but there is hardly anything wrong with that because the very purpose of these works is to make the case for the Shachtman orientation. If Sean Matgamna didn't feel passion for this perspective, which he advocates in the very capable polemic that constitutes the, quote, third book, end quote, these volumes would never have been produced at all. New section. The Trotskyist approach. Writing a capable polemic does not necessarily mean writing a persuasive polemic. For example, I am not persuaded that the ideas and the very nature of Shachtman's Trotskyist opponents, James P. Cannon and others in the Socialist Workers' Party, are adequately characterized or dealt with either by Shachtman or Matgamna. It can certainly be argued that over the long haul their organization held up better than that of Shachtman. Their political orientation proved in some ways less disastrous, avoiding Shachtman's Cold War anti-communism of the 1960s, instead organizing an effective movement against the U.S. war in Vietnam, and their theoretical orientation continues to have much to recommend it. I wonder if he's going to talk about the decline of the Socialist Workers' Party into basically a feudalista party. It is this last point that I want to focus on in the remainder of these comments. As the framework, we must naturally turn our attention to the analysis Shachtman contended with, that developed by Trotsky. As Matgamna correctly emphasizes, quote, Trotsky constantly rethought, conceptualized, readjusted his thinking on the USSR as on other issues, end quote. This is amply demonstrated in Thomas M. Twiss's remarkable new study, Trotsky and the Problem of Soviet Bureaucracy, published by Haymarket Books in 2015, which traces the evolution of Trotsky's analyses and theorizations from the early 1920s to the mid-1930s, replete with brilliant insights blended with false starts, misperceptions, compelling subsequent corrections, and the evolution of a deepening understanding of complex realities. The culmination was the 1936-37 classic, The Revolution Betrayed. The Revolution Betrayed covered a broad array of economic, social, political, and cultural issues. Trotsky went on to argue that the Soviet state and society were fluid, transitional, and could not be defined by, quote, finished social categories, end quote, such as capitalism or socialism. Capitalism was governed by profit-driven market relations, an accumulation process inconsistent with the actual dynamics of the USSR. Socialism could not be reduced to a state-owned economy with top-down centralized planning in a single country, even as large as the USSR. It required genuine democracy and global scope to be viable and consistent with a Marxist understanding of socialism. Instead, Trotsky offered this complex characterization. I don't know if this is a quote. Yeah, I think this is a quote. Quote, "The Soviet Union is a contradictory society halfway between capitalism and socialism, in which A, the productive forces are still far from adequate to give the state property a socialist character, B, the tendency towards primitive accumulation created by want breaks out through innumerable pores of the planned economy, C, norms of distribution preserving a bourgeois character lie at the basis of a new differentiation of society, D, the economic growth, while slowly bettering the situation of the toilers, promotes a swift formation of privileged strata, E, exploiting the social antagonisms of bureaucracy has converted itself into an uncontrolled caste alien to socialism. F, the social revolution betrayed by the ruling party still exists in property relations and in the consciousness of the toiling masses. G, a further development of the accumulating contradictions can as well lead to socialism as back to capitalism. H, on the road to capitalism, the counter-revolution would have to break the resistance of the workers. I, on the road to socialism, the workers would have to overthrow the bureaucracy. In the last analysis, the question will be decided by a struggle of living social forces, both on the national and the world arena." End quote, Trotsky. Trotsky believed that, quote, "only hypotheses are possible," end quote, regarding future developments beyond this transitional stage. One possibility was the eventual restoration of capitalism, which in fact is what finally happened. Trotsky had genuine hopes, however, that the struggle of, quote, "living social forces," end quote, including in the Soviet Union, would move forward towards socialism in the foreseeable future. Concluding that, quote, "the bureaucracy can be removed only by a revolutionary force," end quote, Trotsky noted that, quote, "to prepare this and stand at the head of the masses in a favorable historical situation," end quote, would be, quote, "the task of the Soviet section of the Fourth International," end quote. He admitted that, quote, "today it is still weak and driven underground," end quote, but added that, quote, "the illegal existence of a party is not non-existence," end quote. New section. Problematic developments. This key assumption was to become almost immediately problematical with the onset of what the late historian Vadim Rogovin terms, quote, "political genocide," end quote. Stalin's 1937-38 slaughter of old Bolsheviks and of the majority of Trotskyists who were machine-gunned in the gulags. A case can be made that a failure to adequately factor this horrific fact into his subsequent analyses and theorizations introduced an element of unreality in what Trotsky had to say about the political revolution he advocated. But it is worth giving serious consideration, nonetheless, to what he meant by, quote, "political revolution," end quote. Believing that the political revolution he called for must not substitute one ruling clique for another, Trotsky insisted that, quote, "bureaucratic autocracy must give place to Soviet democracy," end quote, and Trotsky offered details on what this would look like: full freedom of speech and genuinely free elections, with not only a democratization of the Bolshevik Party, but also the freedom of other parties to exist in the redemocratized Soviets, would all be crucial, as would the revival of the trade unions. Quote, "the bringing of democracy into industry means a radical revision of plans in the interest of the toilers. Free discussion of economic problems will decrease the overhead expense of bureaucratic mistakes and zigzags," end quote. Bureaucratic privileges and high-budget, quote, "show-off," end quote, projects would make way for an equitable sharing of social wealth, with decent housing and other social needs being prioritized. Quote, "the youth will receive the opportunity to breathe freely, criticize, make mistakes, and grow up. Science and art will be freed of their chains," end quote. And naturally, quote, "foreign policy will return to the traditions of revolutionary internationalism," end quote. Trotsky believed that such a political revolution would free the nationalized planned economy, flowing from the conquest of the October Revolution of 1917, from the authoritarian bureaucratic stranglehold that would otherwise kill it. The nationalization and planning of the economy was further implemented under Trotsky. I mean, not under Trotsky, under Stalin. That is always something to keep in mind. That the NEP and the so-called triumphs of socialism was a product of Stalin, and the left opposition had an ambiguous relationship to this process. critiquing the details of it, but generally favoring some kind of fast industrialization. Maybe not to the extent of like the so-called like of the conception of Trotsky as like a super industrializer, but definitely definitely had an ambiguous relationship to this process. Check out the piece by Alexei Gusev titled "The Left Op." It's either titled "The Trotskyist Opposition and Stalinist Industrialization" or something like that. And also check out the piece by John Eric Merritt titled "That's something like the Left Opposition, Industrialization," something like that. I can't remember what it's called. Both are good reads. Anyway, Trotsky believed that such a political revolution could free the nationalized planned economy, flowing from the conquest of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, from the authoritarian bureaucratic stranglehold that would otherwise kill it. The Bolsheviks had led the successful struggle to give all power to the Soviets, the democratic workers' councils, thereby creating a workers' state, and which had begun the transition from capitalism to socialism. The bureaucratically degenerated workers' state must be replaced by the reestablishment of a genuinely democratic workers' state. That's the limitation of all these conceptions, is they're like this kind of extremely idealized, whitewashed notion of Bolshevism in the early days of the revolution, in not only during the Civil War, but immediately after the Civil War. It's been amply demonstrated numerous times of how the Bolshevik Party was responsible for the evacuation of democracy within these institutions, and just to act like they were like the most ardent defenders of democracy in principle at this time is laughable. Sorry, but that's just a thought from me, and that's a limit of Matgamna. That's a limit of all of these authors, because they're still operating within the Trotskyist, Leninist frame of mind, which is not as utterly distinct from Stalinism as one would be led to believe, even though the horrors of Stalinism did not take place in this early period. There was precedence for it. Where am I? What Shachtman and others have insisted upon is the loss of political power by the working class makes Trotsky's insistent characterization of the USSR as any kind of worker state incredibly problematical. Combine this with the physical elimination of the forces in the USSR that might have been capable of leading the political revolution for which Trotsky and his co-thinkers were calling, and we seem to have entered a theoretical and political cul-de-sac. Shachtman concluded that the Stalinist bureaucracy was a far more stable formation than Trotsky wanted to believe. Following James Burnham, who later became a right-wing ideologue and whose importance Matgamna goes out of his way to minimize, and Joseph Carter, Shachtman concluded that what had crystallized was a new form of society unanticipated in Marxist theory. This new class society was tagged as bureaucratic collectivism, which Shachtman saw as no better, no less exploitive, no more progressive than capitalism. Within 2 decades, he partially followed Burnham's trajectory, seeing this new tyranny as much worse, far more exploitative, and far less progressive than capitalism. He joined Cold War anti-communists who saw the power of the capitalist United States, whose imperialist foreign policy Shachtman had denounced for over 4 decades, as the strongest bulwark against the totalitarian menace. I don't know if the totalitarian menace is like being cheeky or something like that, but Trotsky repeatedly referred to the Soviet Union is totalitarian. Regardless of whatever you think of like Shachtman's later trajectory. In addition to Trotsky's and Shachtman's approaches, there is the alternative theoretical construct of, quote, state capitalism, end quote. That is, seeing what developed in the USSR as simply a new variant of capitalism, with the bureaucratic state functioning as the, quote, capitalist, end quote, that extracts surplus value from the still exploited proletariat. Different variations of this theoretical approach were developed by the, quote, council communists associated with Anton Pannekoek, Otto Rula, Paul Matic, and others, by the Johnson Forest tendencies and successors associated with CLR James and Raya Dunayevskaya, and by Tony Cliff and others associated with the International Socialist and British Socialist Workers' Party. In 1948, Cliff forecast Shachtman's trajectory. Quote, if the Stalinist regime denotes the decline of civilization, the reactionary negation of capitalism, then it is of course more reactionary than the latter. Capitalism has to be defended from Stalinist barbarism, end quote. Tony Cliff, The Theory of Bureaucratic Collectivism, a Critique, which is on this channel. Partisans of the state capitalist theory, no less than those of the degenerated worker state perspective, have seen bureaucratic collectivism as facilitating a fatal accommodation between would-be Marxist revolutionaries and actually existing capitalism. I would definitely question this. There's definitely more in common between, say, Raya Dunayevskaya and CLR James and Castoriadis and the Council Communists and, say, someone like Hal Draper or Joseph Carter than there is between, there's more in common between those people and any of those people and degenerated worker state people. Scientific socialism. Shachtman's 1940s articulation of the theory of bureaucratic collectivism, however, does not inevitably lead to an alignment with the foreign policy of U.S. imperialism. Among the partisans of the theory who did not abandon revolutionary politics are Julius and Phyllis Jacobson, Hal Draper, and others who produced the journal New Politics, various comrades associated with the U.S. group Solidarity, etc. No less important than the revolutionary honor of such partisans, however, is the theory's value for what some of us call scientific socialism, a commitment to struggling for socialism that is grounded in serious utilization of what today are the disciplines of history, economics, sociology, and political science. Bureaucratic collectivism certainly has value as a descriptive term. The economy is collectivized, not a market economy, but is dominated and ruled by an authoritarian regime representing a privileged and powerful bureaucratic apparatus. But what Shachtman meant by, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, was more than that. The apparatus was seen as a socioeconomic class, similar to the slave-owning patricians of ancient Rome, the hereditary aristocracy of feudal times, and the capitalists of our own day. Similarly, bureaucratic collectivism was presented as a new form of class society. From our own historical vantage point, the roughly 50-year existence of the purportedly, quote, new stage of class society, end quote, does suggest the possibility that Shachtman and his comrades were experiencing an optical illusion. As Trotsky argued, it was all much more transitory than they believed, although certainly less transitory than Trotsky himself had anticipated. Marcel Vanderlyn, in his excellent survey of contending theories, Western Marxism and the Soviet Union, has noted that, quote, it is perfectly clear that the Soviet society can hardly be explained in orthodox Marxist terms at all, end quote. In examining the predominant theoretical variants, 1, degenerated worker state, 1, degenerated worker state, 2, bureaucratic collectivism, and 3, state capitalism, he concluded that a fully adequate analysis of the USSR is yet to be developed. Vanderlyn adds that this does, quote, not mean to imply that the old theories are of no use whatever in further theoretical developments, end quote, suggesting, correctly in my opinion, that each approach has in fact proved capable of generating valuable insights and analyses. To the extent that this is true, and that the materials in these volumes also provide valuable primary sources on the important history of U.S. and world Trotskyism, those committed to a truly scientific socialism in efforts to understand and change the world should see the publication of these volumes as a positive contribution. The end. There's a little bio of Paul LeBlanc here. Paul LeBlanc is a long-standing socialist activist in the USA. Paula Blanc is the author of many books, including Leon Trotsky, Unfinished Leninism, Lenin and the Revolutionary Party, Socialism or Barbarism, Selected Writings of Rosa Luxemburg, and Selected Writings of C.L.R. James. He was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party USA, which is the Cannonite segment of American Trotskyism. Before the Socialist Workers' Party's Castroite turn after 1979, part of the opposition to that turn, then a member of the Fourth Internationalist Tendency and subsequently Solidarity. Today he's a member of the International Socialist Organization. The end.